Welcome to the Black Pill. We're talking public diagnoses of presidential candidates 4 years or 50 years after it's relevant, I guess, depending on your perspective. Um, the duty to warn. Should psychologists or psychiatrists sort of break confidence to tell the public that Donald Trump is a psychopath or a narcissist or a psychopathic narcissist or a malignant narcissist or whatever the words are that people in the profession throw around? Is that cool? No. Thanks for stopping by. See you later. Yeah, we have to fill up minutes. That's how YouTube works. So let's fill them up. Let's talk Tarasoff. The Tarasoff warning applies to patients or clients who have made a specific, credible threat against an identifiable individual. So they have to have told you that they plan on killing one person in particular, who that person is, you have to know their name, and they'd have to be in a position to execute that threat. And then you're permitted to break confidentiality. Confidentiality is sort of the keystone of the psychotherapeutic endeavor, one of the keystones of the medical endeavor. If someone comes to me and they have problems, I am permitted to diagnose them, and keeping that diagnosis confidential is really what makes the whole system go around. If I just blab to everybody that this person has problems, then no one's ever going to come to me for help. Okay. What applies to Trump here? Nothing. Hang on though. So the Tarasoff case, it was a case of a guy who decided he was going to murder his girlfriend, and he was experiencing paranoid schizophrenia. The psychiatrist, a lot of this is psychiatry rather than psychology, the psychiatrist called campus police because this was an on-campus relationship, and the police picked the guy up, but he seemed lucid to them, so they let the dude go, and he did the murder. The victim, her name was Tarasoff, and that's why it's the Tarasoff rule. Tarasoff warning. So from that case, where we get to is we have a duty to protect the potential victim. And this usually means contacting police and almost certainly warning the individual. So do we have a duty to warn the general public? Well, let's table that. Put a pin in that, as the better than me internet commentators suggest. What else we have is called the Goldwater Rule. And when Barry Goldwater was running in the late 60s, there were some publications. A big magazine surveyed a bunch of psychiatrists, and like 2 out of 3 psychiatrists or something said that Barry Goldwater was unfit to serve. And they had a bunch of like Freudian stuff to back up those claims. The American Psychiatric Association thereafter directed their membership against making statements about presidential candidates. And that might have something to do with a libel suit from Barry Goldwater. And in 2016, the American Psychological Association sort of followed that protocol and told psychology at large that we are not to make public statements about presidential candidates. Obviously referring to Trump because so many psychologists seem to think he has issues. It's not really formally in the ethics code. If it were in the ethics code, then we wouldn't need these sort of pronouncements from the leadership. It's still unethical. It's bad practice, and let's run through why. I mean, to start with, I just don't know of anyone who's been censured by by the psychiatric ethics boards or the psychological ethics boards for using their credentials to make these sorts of statements about Trump or really any other president. I don't know that it's ever happened. If someone knows, like, that's a good use of the comment section. So item 1, diagnosing strangers is just unethical. I don't know Trump. I don't know Biden. I don't know Kamala Harris. I don't know whoever's going to be on the ticket in 24. If there's a ticket in 28, I don't know who's going to be on it. It's unethical because we don't have all the relevant information. All that we have is public behavior, but that public behavior could mean anything. It could mean anything at all, right? Kellyanne Conway, in the first days of the Trump administration, she's defending some ridiculous claim that what's his head has made, the White House press secretary of the time has made about crowd sizes. It seems like it is, and Chuck Todd is kind of holding her feet to the fire a little bit, and she goes, "Well, he just gave alternative facts to that." And he goes, but alternative facts are falsehoods, right? The very famous alternative facts moment. And like, if you were into micro expressions, go recall that clip and watch Kellyanne go before she says it's fast. It's, I'm really exaggerating it. It's super fast. And like, I could go, well, that indicates she's not really a psychopath. She's doing a psychopathic thing for sure. Like lying on television every day, we know that these are lies because we can objectively check things like how big crowd sizes are and then compare them to statements made. These are lies. That's not a psychological statement to say someone's a lying liar whose pants are on fire. And Kellyanne seemed to have some trouble making that statement. But do I know that? Can I assert this was a micro expression revealing that, in fact, she has a conscience, unlike a lot of her peers? No. She could have had a little bit of lint stuck to her uvula that made her have to swallow at that moment, Her mouth could have filled up with spit. I don't know. I have no idea. I have no idea what's going on in her head. Maybe she's a psychopath. Maybe she isn't. It's none of my business. It would be unethical to really get in there and start accusing people of psychiatric ailments. And we aren't helping the person. We're not helping Trump. We're not helping Kellyanne. Psychiatry and psychology exist to help people. That's what they're for. The first 2 items on the APA Code of Ethics, American Psychological Association Code of Ethics, they're beneficence and non-malfeasance. That is, you must help the people you serve, and you must do no harm to anybody, whether you serve them or not. And so reaching out and telling the world our stories about what we think diagnoses apply to public figures, it breaks both rules. We're not helping that public figure. It would be a very contorted argument. Don't try it. You might hurt yourself. Very contorted argument to suggest that. And you're probably hurting people if they pay attention to you at all. Like Donald Trump is worried about what psychiatrists think of him in the New York Times or something. Whatever. What else? Diagnosing people in public is unethical. We have no contract for the privacy of the person, and because we have no contracts and no informed consent forms, they haven't consented to having private information revealed to the public, and all of that is very much in the ethics codes. And public shaming is harm by definition. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you think the guy is going to break democracy for more reasons that we're getting to. You're not permitted to harm them for any reason. And there is no duty to warn, because we're not involved in a therapeutic relationship with the person. We don't have any contracts. We don't have any informed consents. We don't have a relationship at all. let alone a therapeutic one, there is no duty to warn. The person's not our patient, they're not our client, and they have not made credible threats to an individual, and we don't have any specific threat that nobody else is aware of. Right? So here's where we pull that pin on the Tarasoff thing. In Tarasoff, the person has to say, I intend to murder Judy Garland with the rope in the conservatory at 9:45 in the morning. And then you can call Judy Garland and say, hey, this person wants to play Clue with you in a murdery kind of way. I would stay low for a second while we sort it out. Right? But Trump isn't like, he's not going to therapy with a psychiatrist and saying, I plan on being the next Hitler. We're gonna do X, Y, and Z that are not public statements. Well, they'd have to affect some individual, and then you could warn that individual. That's not licensed to diagnose someone at a distance and then wander out into public and that. There may be times when it is moral to violate the ethics code. Okay. We should all resist unlawful orders if we're in sort of a military or paramilitary structure. When we get immoral or unlawful orders, we should resist those. And we should disobey unjust laws. We're marching for freedom, and the mayor quickly gets a law on the books, a local ordinance that marches aren't permitted. We have to ignore it and go out and march anyway. One such case in psychology, most of the ethics bodies have sort of fixed their local rules. Here, where I live, it used to be if an adult told you that they had been sexually abused as a child, then we had a duty to report that to Child Protective Services or the police. And the problem was that sometimes people would be 50 or 60 years old and they're reporting for the first time this thing that happened when they were 5 or 6 years old. The perpetrator's dead. The perpetrator's been dead a long time. They're not out there to harm anybody else, which is what would drive that part of the ethics code. And so when we report it, the police or CPS are going to start asking some elderly people some really uncomfortable questions. That's going to stir up a bunch of stuff in the family that nobody at this time is ready to have stirred up. And so we just made this change in the last 12 years or so locally, that adults have the ability to defer that reporting, right? That they have the right to make the decision. And we'll have all kinds of questions like, is this person still alive? Have they been convicted of any sex crimes, or are they still out there? Are they with people who are vulnerable? Do they have the capacity to keep doing crime? And then over time, we'll sort of make the case that this should be reported, but for adults now, right? And that law got changed because it was a rule that ought not be followed, so people didn't follow it. So there might be times when violating the ethics code is moral, and I'm making the case this isn't really one of those. It isn't really one of those times. It's unnecessary and it's insufficient. For Trump, it's unnecessary and it's insufficient. That is, it's unnecessary because we don't need to say Trump is a megalomaniac or a psychopath or a narcissist, because everybody can see his behavior for themselves with their own eyes. Right? Okay? So maybe they're getting their news from someplace that's not really covering the most extravagant of his behavior, or they're providing a lot of covering fire for his most abusive, his worst behaviors. Fox News is really talking up Putin right now. It's really good to be on the good side of Putin, for fuck's sake. But in that case, they're not getting the message about Trump and his alleged psychiatric disorders anyway. Everyone can see for themselves at the rallies on the nonstop 24-hour coverage of Trump that he's a racist, sexist, xenophobic opportunist with no permanent moral or ethical code to speak of. That's just obvious. It's not a mental illness or a psychological disorder. Evil is not a matter for psychology. Evil's not a matter for psychology. And everyone can see this for themselves. They're deluding themselves, however. So it's not necessary. The information that should be driving decision making is out there. Nor is it sufficient. I just don't know anybody, any living human, who changed their minds about voting Trump because some psychiatrists broke cover, stepped out of the ethics code, violated the Goldwater Rule, and said he's a narcissist or something. It's not driving any kind of decision-making process. I mean, it's a great New York Times headline, I guess. It makes a lot of a certain kind of noise. But it doesn't really change anybody's mind. And lastly, it's harmful to the public. Like, maybe you don't give a shit about hurting Trump. You're not a pacifist. He's not your client. You have no obligation not to hurt him, right? The ethics board just wouldn't be involved if you assault somebody in the street. The ethics board only cares about you if you assault someone using your credentials somehow. And you don't have a relationship here. But it's harmful to the public. That is, there are all sorts of psychological disorders. In the business, we don't even say mental illness anymore. Mental illness is really a drug sales word because, thoughts can't be sick. Thoughts don't have any biology. Brains have biology, but thoughts are abstractions, and they don't have cell structure, and so they can't be sick. If depression's a mental illness, how do you catch it? From a dirty toilet seat at the bus station? Sit down, Derek. We say psychological disorders now. That's the language of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illness, version 5. And there are all sorts of disorders. When you start calling those mental illness and deciding people are unfit to serve if they have any mental illness, well, that rules out about a quarter of people in their lifetimes. Have you never experienced depression? Anxiety that's risen to like a clinical threshold. You thought you might have it looked at. People who experience autism, people with ADHD, people with dyslexia. Are we going to stop people from running for president because they have dyslexia or dysmathia? There are all sorts of psychological disorders, and very few of them actually prevent a life of service. Good decision-making, strategic thinking, presentations to the public. And the few that do, in their extreme forms, are like really, really obvious. They're really obvious. Okay. So in the case of a narcissist, people leaving relationships with narcissists usually know that person's a narcissist. By the time they've been chewed up and spat out, they know they're dealing with a malignant or psychopathic or narcissistic person. It's really obvious. Yeah. And it plays well. Like, there are some roles in which you actively want psychopaths. Psychopaths make great surgeons because when it's time to cut somebody, it's not good to have empathy for that person. It's good to have a bit of a God complex, actually. If you're landing a plane, you have four engines and one just went out, and then while you're on the radio, the second one goes out. Man, it's nice if in that situation your heart rate and your blood pressure drop rather than raising. And narcissists are really good at getting and keeping leadership positions. That is, the narcissism is attractive to people. It might even be a bit of a demand characteristic, meaning that the pressures of the job make someone behave in a way that's more narcissistic than they'd usually behave. And president, for sure, is one of those where you have to be out all the time in front of cameras, talking things up, getting attention. In the attention economy, being a bit chaotic and even getting negative press seems to be a bit of a demand characteristic. And Kellyanne Conway just lying egregiously all day on television every day of the Trump administration. That's a demand characteristic. That's the role of the job. To turn around and call her a psychopath, that is whether or not it's true. And I don't have evidence to say that it's true. If I did, I wouldn't tell you. Right? It's neither necessary nor sufficient. Everyone knows who these people are, and they're making a decision. They're making a decision. And that ultimately is the saddest thing of all.